Hey guys, welcome back to the YouTube channel, The Second World War. In this video, we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments of the war. November 16th, 1951. The morning fog lifts off Portsmouth Harbor as Captain Dennis Campbell climbs the gangway to HMS Illustrious. In his briefcase rests a single sheet of paper, a diagram so simple a child could draw it. A flight deck angled 10 degrees to port. Nothing revolutionary on its face, but what he doesn't know is that within 18 months, this sketch will save more naval aviators' lives than any weapon system ever invented. What Captain Campbell does know, however, terrifies him. In the past 12 months alone, the Royal Navy lost 43 aircraft to landing accidents. 43 machines destroyed, 17 pilots killed, dozens more maimed. Every single loss occurred during the final 30 seconds of flight, that desperate moment when a 30-ton jet traveling 140 miles per hour attempts to catch a wire on a pitching deck while a steel barricade waits 60 feet ahead, ready to shred any aircraft that misses. The Americans faced even worse numbers. In 1951, U.S. Navy carrier aviation suffered 776 Class A mishaps, accidents resulting in death or aircraft loss, more than 2 per day. During peacetime, the Korean War amplified the carnage. USS Boxer reported 7 barrier crashes in a single deployment. Princeton lost 9 aircraft in 4 weeks. On straight-deck carriers, missing the arresting wires meant one outcome. You hit the barricade at full throttle, or you plowed into the aircraft parked forward, creating a fireball that could kill a dozen men in seconds. The jet age had arrived, but carrier aviation couldn't keep up. The F-9F Panther landed 40 knots faster than the propeller-driven Hellcat. The new jet's engines took 7 seconds to spool up from idle, an eternity when you're sinking toward the ocean at 20 feet per second. Landing signal officers stood on the carrier's port quarter, frantically waving paddles. But by the time a pilot recognized he was coming in too low, too fast, or too high, physics had already written his fate. Every admiral, every engineer, every test pilot knew the truth. Carrier aviation had reached its breaking point. Jets were the future, but futures don't matter when the present is killing your people. What Captain Campbell doesn't know, what nobody in that Portsmouth meeting room knows, is that his insane idea will be rejected, mocked, and called impossible by the very experts whose job is solving impossible problems, and that the breakthrough will come not from committees or wind tunnels, but from one man's refusal to accept that good men should die for a design flaw. The problem began in 1945, the moment Lieutenant Commander William P. Roan made the first jet landing aboard USS Wake Island. His FFR-1 Fireball touched down at 90 knots, 20 knots faster than any piston fighter, and the arresting gear cables screamed as they absorbed the kinetic energy. The landing was successful. The warning was ignored. By 1950, every major navy faced the same crisis. Jet engines revolutionized speed and altitude, but their slow throttle response created a deadly trap. On propeller aircraft, pilots chopped throttle on the landing signal officer's cut signal and literally fell onto the deck. Jets couldn't do that. They had to land power on, maintaining thrust until the wheels touched, because their engines took too long to accelerate if they needed to go around. This created a hellish scenario. Pilots flew their final approach with engines spooled up, committed to landing, unable to climb quickly if they missed the wires. On a straight-deck carrier, 4 arresting wires stretched across 60 feet of deck. Behind them, the crash barricade, a web of steel cables designed to catch aircraft that missed. Behind that, rows of parked aircraft, fuel trucks, ammunition carts, everything needed to turn the flight deck into an active combat zone. The mathematics were brutal. A Panther landing at 125 knots covered 211 feet per second. If a pilot missed all 4 wires, he had exactly 2.1 seconds before hitting the barricade. The barricade worked sometimes. When it failed, 30 tons of jet fuel and ordnance plowed into the aircraft parked forward at 100 miles per hour. Captain Bruce Williams, Air Operations Officer on USS Kearsarge, watched 11 men die when a barrier failed in March 1951. The accident report noted, aircraft struck barrier at full power. Barrier separated. Aircraft continued forward into 6 parked Corsairs. Resulting fire reached aviation gasoline stores. 14 aircraft destroyed. 11 personnel killed. 23 injured. Carrier operations suspended 48 hours. The solution everyone tried, better barriers. The British developed the flex deck, a rubberized landing surface that theoretically could catch jets without landing gear. Test pilot Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown made 40 landings on the system at Farnborough. He called it fundamentally sound in reports. He called it bloody terrifying to his friends. The Americans built stronger barricades. The Bureau of Aeronautics spent $3.2 million developing the Davis Barrier System, a mechanical web that could stop a 25,000-pound aircraft at full throttle. When it worked, it was impressive. When it failed, the devastation was total. But stronger barriers didn't prevent crashes, they just contained them. Every senior aviator knew the real problem, the flight deck itself. Captain William T. Razier, head of aviation military characteristics at the Office of the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, wrote in June 1945, current landing procedures force all aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error. This is incompatible with jet aircraft performance characteristics. Translation, we designed our carriers for propeller aircraft that could land at 70 knots and abort at the last second. Jets land at 130 knots and can't abort. We're trying to land 1952 aircraft on 1942 ships. People will die until we fix this. Everyone agreed. Everyone saw the problem, but nobody could solve it. The British tried flex decks. The Americans tried better barriers and backup barriers and emergency net systems. The French tried reducing aircraft weight. Nothing worked. The accident rate climbed. What they needed was someone crazy enough to question the one thing nobody questioned. Why does the landing area have to be parallel to the ship's axis? What they needed was Dennis Campbell. Captain Dennis Royal Farson Campbell wasn't supposed to solve anything. He was a bureaucrat. Born November 13, 1907 in Southsea, England, Campbell entered the Royal Navy in 1925 as a midshipman. He qualified as a pilot in September 1931, early enough to fly fabric biplanes, late enough to understand that naval aviation wasn't a gentleman's hobby, but a profession that demanded engineering precision. During World War II, he flew Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, the obsolete aircraft that nonetheless crippled the Bismarck. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross. Nobody called him a genius. Nobody called him a visionary. After the war, the Admiralty assigned him to the Ministry of Supply as Deputy Chief RN Representative, a desk job managing technical liaison between the Navy and civilian contractors. He had 0 engineering credentials, no advanced degrees. His job was paperwork, tracking development schedules, attending coordination meetings, signing requisitions. But Dennis Campbell had one quality that credentials can't teach. He couldn't ignore dead pilots.
In 1951, he attended the funeral of Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a test pilot killed when his jet hit the barricade on HMS Implacable. Lithgow had been Campbell's student, 23 years old. Perfect approach, perfect speed, but he'd floated 6 feet too far and missed the wires. The barricade failed. Lithgow's aircraft disintegrated. His widow was 5 months pregnant. Campbell stood at that graveside and later told his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, "This is insane. We're murdering them with our own equipment. A pilot does everything right and still dies because 60 feet isn't enough margin for error. There has to be another way." Goodhart expected nothing more. Officers say things like that at funerals, but Campbell kept obsessing. He pulled accident reports. He interviewed LSOs. He studied landing patterns. He wasn't an engineer, so he did what non-engineers do. He drew pictures. The revelation came during a train ride from Portsmouth to London. Campbell sketched flight decks in his notebook, trying to visualize how to give pilots more room. If you can't make the landing area longer, make it wider. If you can't make it wider because the ship has a fixed beam, angle it. Angle it. He drew a flight deck canted 10 degrees to port. Now the landing zone didn't end at the barricade. It ended in open water. A pilot who missed the wires could shove his throttle forward, climb away, and try again. No barricade, no parked aircraft, no catastrophic collision, just air and ocean, and a second chance. The idea was so simple it felt stupid, which meant either he'd discovered something brilliant or he'd overlooked something obvious that every real engineer already knew. On August 7, 1951, Captain Dennis Campbell convened a meeting in the Ministry of Supply.
Captain Campbell, the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, has a painted outline runway. We can paint an angled deck outline on HMS Triumph's flight deck. In 1 week, we run simulated touch-and-go approaches. If the drift problem is real, we'll measure it. If it's theoretical catastrophizing, we'll know that too. Rear Admiral Slattery leaned back. "Lewis, you understand that if you paint an angled deck on Triumph and pilots start crashing, you're ending both your career and Captain Campbell." "Noted, sir. And if it works?" Boatington smiled. "Then we stop killing pilots who did everything right." The tests began September 1951. HMS Triumph left Portsmouth with an angled deck painted in white outline across her axial flight deck. Not a structural modification, just paint. For 3 weeks, Navy pilots made touch-and-go approaches, pretending the painted line was a real deck edge. The drift problem predicted didn't exist. Pilots adapted in 2 landings. What they discovered instead was freedom. Lieutenant Peter Chilton, one of the test pilots, later wrote, "I came in too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time in my career, I wasn't terrified. I just poured on power and climbed away. No barrier waiting to kill me. No aircraft ahead. Just clean air and a second chance. I felt like I'd been given my life back." By October, the painted deck trials proved the concept worked. Now came the hard part, convincing everyone else. Because HMS Triumph was British, the carrier with the biggest problem, the carrier whose pilots were dying at twice the Royal Navy's rate, was American, and the U.S. Navy didn't take kindly to British officers telling them how to land planes. September 14, 1951. U.S. Naval Air Test Center, Puxon River, Maryland. Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown stands in front of 40 American test pilots and feels every eye in the room calculating whether to trust him. Brown is the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, the man who's landed more aircraft types than anyone in history.
He holds every British naval aviation record that matters, and right now, none of that matters, because he's about to tell the U.S. Navy that their carriers are designed wrong. Gentlemen, Brown begins, in the past 12 months, how many of you have hit the barricade? 7 hands go up, then 12, then 15. How many of you know someone who died hitting the barricade? Every hand goes up. Brown opens his briefcase. I'm going to show you something the Royal Navy is testing. It's going to sound insane, but I've made 63 landings on it, and I'm standing here instead of being scraped off a deck. So I'm asking you to hear me out. He pins Campbell's diagram to the wall, an aircraft carrier flight deck angled 8 degrees to port. The room explodes. You want us to land sideways? The LSO can't see the approach angle. What about the island? You've moved the landing zone toward the superstructure. Brown waits for the noise to subside. Every objection you just shouted we had, every single one. Then we tested it, and here's what we found. When you miss the wires on an angled deck, you don't die. You throttle up and go around. Simple as that. Commander Harold Buell, commanding officer of VF-84, stands. Commander Brown, I've been landing on carriers since 1943. What you're describing violates every principle we've developed through 8 years of combat operations. You're asking us to throw away proven doctrine for a British theory. I'm asking you to stop dying for a design flaw. The room goes silent. Brown continues. You're landing jets on straight decks because that's what you have. But straight decks were designed for Corsairs and Hellcats that could cut throttle and fall onto the deck. Jets can't do that. So you're forcing 1952 aircraft into 1942 operations, and your people are dying because of it. The angled deck doesn't violate doctrine. It adapts the carrier to match the aircraft. Rear Admiral Apollo Susk, the senior U.S. Navy aviator in London, steps forward. I've observed the Triumph tests. Commander Brown is correct. The concept works. I've recommended to CNO that we run parallel tests on USS Midway. But Rear Admiral Alfred Pride, chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, shakes his head. We're already testing solutions. The Davis barrier has a 98.7% success rate. 98.7% of what? Brown interrupts. Of the aircraft that hit it? What about the pilots who never reach the barricade because they see it coming and panic? What about the ones who deliberately ditch in the ocean rather than risk hitting the barricade at full power? Your statistic measures barrier performance. It doesn't measure pilot survival. The room erupts again. Half the pilots are nodding, the other half look ready to throw Brown off the base. Admiral Susk raises his voice. Gentlemen, silence. We will test the angled deck on USS Midway. Paint trials, simulated landings. If it works, we modify one carrier for full structural implementation. If it fails, we bury the idea. But we will not continue losing pilots to a design we can test and potentially fix. Are we clear? Admiral Pride stands for 10 seconds. He says nothing. Then, Midway trials authorized. But if this British pipe dream causes a single additional casualty, I'm terminating the program and everyone associated with it. Susk nods. Agreed. The meeting ends. Brown packs his briefcase, knowing he's just bet his career on a painted line. What he doesn't know, within 90 days, the painted line on Midway will work so well that the U.S. Navy will convert USS Antietam into the first true angled deck carrier in the world. If you're fascinated by the moment when one person's courage changed history, make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell icon, because what happened next when the first pilot landed on Antietam's angled deck changed naval warfare forever. But first, let me tell you about January 12, 1953. Off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell pulls his F-9 F-5 Panther into the landing pattern behind USS Antietam. This is his 43rd carrier landing, but it's his first on an angled deck that's not painted. It's real. An 8-degree sponson extending from the port side, structurally welded to the carrier's hull. Buell doesn't trust it. He's trained his entire career to hit the wires or face the barricade. That fear has saved his life twice. Now they're telling him to forget it. He drops his landing gear, adjusts trim, calls the ball. Panther ball 3.2. Roger ball, the landing signal officer responds. Buell's approach is perfect until it isn't. A wind gust lifts his eye. Aircraft 6 feet. He's high. On a straight deck, this is where the LSO would give him a wave off, and Buell would have to climb away, burn fuel, and try again. But today, the LSO says nothing, because on an angled deck, being high isn't a catastrophe, it's a correction opportunity. Buell drops his nose slightly, bleeds off the altitude, but now he's long. He's going to miss the wires. On a straight deck, this is where panic sets in, where pilots make desperate corrections that cause crashes. But Buell forces himself to follow the briefing. If you miss, you climb. The deck is clear. Trust it. His wheels slam down. He bounces once. His tailhook skips over the 1-wire, skips over the 2-wire, skips over the 3-wire, skips over the 4-wire. He's missed all of them. On a straight deck, the barricade would already be tearing his aircraft apart. But there's no barricade, just open deck and clear air. Buell shoves his throttle to full power. His J-48 engine spools up in 6 seconds, an eternity that feels like a gift. The aircraft lifts. He's flying again. 23 seconds later, he's back in the pattern. Second approach. This time he catches the 3-wire. Perfect landing. Buell climbs out of his cockpit shaking, not from fear, from relief he didn't know he'd been carrying for years. He'll later write in his autobiography, "To an experienced tailhooker, landing a jet airplane on an angled deck was sheer bliss. For the first time in my career, I wasn't afraid of dying during every approach. The psychological weight that lifted off me that day, I didn't realize I'd been carrying until it was gone." Over the next 60 days, Carrier Group 8 makes 1,327 landings on Antietam. They record 8 bolters, missed wires requiring go-arounds. On a straight deck, 8 bolters might have meant 5 barrier crashes, 2 aircraft destroyed, and 1 or 2 pilots killed. On the angled deck, 0 crashes, 0 destroyed aircraft, 0 injuries. The data is undeniable. Before angled deck, 1950-1952, U.S. Navy carrier aviation averages 647 Class A mishaps per year. Landing accidents account for 52% of all losses. After angled deck implementation, 1955-1957, Class A mishaps dropped to 321 per year. Landing accidents account for 19% of losses. The reduction? 75% fewer landing accidents, 80% fewer barrier-related fatalities. But statistics don't tell the human story. Lieutenant James Davidson does. On March 8, 1953, Davidson brings his damaged Panther back to Antietam.
Hydraulic failure, no flaps, landing speed 20 knots too fast. On a straight deck, he would have ditched in the ocean rather than risk a barrier crash at 145 knots. But Antietam has an angled deck. Davidson makes 4 approaches, misses the wires on every attempt. On the 4th try, he catches the 4-wire doing 142 knots, the fastest successful carrier landing recorded to that point. His aircraft stops with 11 feet of deck remaining. He writes to Captain Campbell 6 months later, "Sir, I never met you, but I'm alive to write this letter because you had an idea everyone said was impossible. My daughter was born last month. I got to be there because you refused to accept that good pilots should die for bad design. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you." The British implement angled decks on Ark Royal in 1955. The French convert Clemenceau. The Australians modify Melbourne. By 1957, every major aircraft carrier in the Western world either has an angled deck or is being retrofitted with one. The Soviets initially reject the concept. In 1959, after a series of catastrophic landing accidents on their straight-deck carrier Varyag, they quietly implement it. Soviet naval records declassified in 1993 show landing accidents dropped 68% within 6 months. But the most powerful testimony comes from the pilots themselves. Captain John Moore, who flew combat missions over Vietnam from USS Coral Sea, "I made 947 carrier landings between 1954 and 1973. I boltered, missed all the wires 62 times on a straight deck. That's 62 potential barrier crashes, 62 chances to die or kill the sailors working forward. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again." Every pilot my age has a moment when we think about the friends who died in the 50s hitting barricades. We're alive because Dennis Campbell drew a line on a piece of paper and refused to shut up about it. By 1975, the angled deck is so universal that young pilots don't even know carriers used to be designed differently. It's not an innovation anymore, it's just how carriers work. The revolution is complete when it becomes invisible. The angled deck saved thousands of lives, but Dennis Campbell never sought fame for it. In fact, what he did after the breakthrough might surprise you even more. But before we get to that, if you know a veteran or someone who loves military history, share this video with them. These stories matter. Now, here's what happened to the man who changed carrier aviation forever. Captain Dennis Campbell never gave a press interview about the angled deck. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1954. He attended the ceremonies when HMS Ark Royal launched, the first carrier in the world designed from the keel up with an angled deck. Reporters asked him for comments. He directed them to Louis Bodington and the engineers at Farnborough. When the U.S. Navy invited him to the commissioning of USS Forrestal in 1955, the first American supercarrier equipped with angled deck, steam catapults, and arresting gear, Campbell sent his regrets. He was attending a funeral for a Royal Navy lieutenant killed in a training accident. Not a carrier accident, a helicopter crash, unrelated to anything Campbell had worked on, but the lieutenant had served under him in 1943, and Campbell believed you attended funerals for your people, always. In 1957, the Admiralty awarded him the CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, for services to naval aviation. The citation was 2 sentences. Campbell kept it in a drawer. He retired from the Royal Navy in 1960 and took a position as a technical consultant for Hawker Siddeley Aviation, working on the development of vertical takeoff jets. Colleagues remember him as obsessively focused on pilot safety, often irritating designers by adding unnecessary redundancies to cockpit systems. Dennis would slow down every design review, recalled engineer Anthony Marsh, asking questions like, "What happens if this fails at night in bad weather?" We'd tell him the odds of that failure were 1 in 10,000. He'd say, "What does the pilot do when it happens?" He never cared about odds. He cared about the one pilot who got unlucky. Campbell died on April 6, 2000, at age 92. His obituary in the Times was 4 paragraphs. The Guardian ran 6. Both mentioned the angled deck. Neither captured what it meant. What it meant. Every carrier landing since 1953 happens because one pilot refused to accept that colleagues should die preventably. Today, every aircraft carrier in the world, American, British, French, Indian, Chinese, Russian, uses an angled deck. The U.S. Navy's newest Gerald R. Ford-class carriers feature advanced electromagnetic catapults and arresting gear, but the deck is still angled 8 degrees to port, exactly as Campbell drew it in 1951. Modern carrier pilots make over 15,000 landings per year across the U.S. Navy's fleet alone. Bolter rate, approximately 8%. That's 200 missed wire approaches annually. Without the angled deck, those were 1,200 potential barrier crashes. How many lives saved? Hundreds per year. Over 70 years, tens of thousands. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black, U.S. Marine Corps, retired, flew FA-18s off carriers from 1985 to 2007. He hunted down Campbell's family in 2003 and sent them a letter. It read, "I never met your father, but I made 147 carrier landings during my career. I boltered, missed all the wires, 14 times on a straight deck. That's 14 times I might have died. Instead, I just climbed away and tried again." Every pilot my age has a moment when we think about the friends who died in the 50s hitting barricades. We're alive because Dennis Campbell drew a line on a piece of paper and refused to shut up about it. By 1975, the angled deck is so universal that young pilots don't even know carriers used to be designed differently. It's not an innovation anymore. It's just how carriers work. The revolution is complete when it becomes invisible. The angled deck saved thousands of lives, but Dennis Campbell never sought fame for it. In fact, what he did after the breakthrough might surprise you even more. But before we get to that, if you know a veteran or someone who loves military history, share this video with them. These stories matter. Now, here's what happened to the man who changed carrier aviation forever. Captain Dennis Campbell never gave a press interview about the angled deck. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1954. He attended the ceremonies when HMS Ark Royal launched, the first carrier in the world designed from the keel up with an angled deck. Reporters asked him for comments. He directed them to Louis Boddington and the engineers at Farnborough. When the U.S. Navy invited him to the commissioning of USS Forrestal in 1955, the first American supercarrier equipped with angled deck, steam catapults, and arresting gear, Campbell sent his regrets. He was attending a funeral for a Royal Navy lieutenant killed in a training accident. Not a carrier accident, a helicopter crash, unrelated to anything Campbell had worked on, but the lieutenant had served under him in 1943, and Campbell believed you attended funerals for your people, always.
In 1957, the Admiralty awarded him the CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, for services to naval aviation. The citation was 2 sentences. Campbell kept it in a drawer. He retired from the Royal Navy in 1960 and took a position as a technical consultant for Hawker Siddeley Aviation, working on the development of vertical takeoff jets. Colleagues remember him as obsessively focused on pilot safety, often irritating designers by adding unnecessary redundancies to cockpit systems. Dennis would slow down every design review, recalled engineer Anthony Marsh, asking questions like, "What happens if this fails at night in bad weather?" We'd tell him the odds of that failure were 1 in 10,000. He'd say, "What does the pilot do when it happens?" He never cared about odds. He cared about the one pilot who got unlucky. Campbell died on April 6, 2000, at age 92. His obituary in the Times was 4 paragraphs. The Guardian ran 6. Both mentioned the angled deck. Neither captured what it meant. What it meant: every carrier landing since 1953 happens because one pilot refused to accept that colleagues should die preventably. Today, every aircraft carrier in the world, American, British, French, Indian, Chinese, Russian, uses an angled deck. The U.S. Navy's newest Gerald R. Ford-class carriers feature advanced electromagnetic catapults and arresting gear, but the deck is still